Ladies and gentlemen, I welcome you all to our public lecture series on Europe as an idea. This organization is provided by Public Diplomacy Office of the Turkish Prime Ministry and Department of Political Science and International Relations. I would like to thank Dr. Ahmet Demirhan for his efforts to refresh the idea of Europe in Turkish intellectual agenda. Today we have a distinguished guest, Professor Ian Almond from Georgia State University. Professor Almond is currently teaching at Georgia State University and he is specialized on transnational literatures. He teaches mostly in the area of South Asian and post-colonial literature and theory. He is a well-known academic and intellectual specialized on religious studies, post-colonial studies, political philosophy, social theory, and including representations of Islam. He received his BA degree from Warwick and PhD from Edinburgh University. He has spent most of his academic life in Italy and Germany and a research year in India. But when I met with Professor Almond last year in Fairfax, it was surprising to hear some local stories from Kayseri, because he lived in Turkey for 6 years and worked for Erciyes and Boğaziçi universities. He's the author of 4 books, Sufism and Deconstruction, The New Orientalists, Postmodern Representations of Islam. Another interesting book, Two Faiths, One Banner, When Muslims Marched with Christians Across Europe's Battlegrounds, published by Harvard University Press. And again, History of Islam in German Thought. These are the some basic works, but of course there are a lot of articles that I cannot mention them here. The title of today's presentation is 5 Ways of Deconstructing Europe. And now the discussant of this presentation is another leading intellectual and academic, Professor Zeynep Direk from Galatasaray University. She focuses on contemporary philosophy, phenomenology, deconstructionism, social and political philosophy. Her discussion will be followed by Ian's response, and then we will have Q&A sessions. And now the floor is yours, Professor Ian.
Hello, okay, you can all hear me. Her şeyden önce selam söylemek istiyorum arkadaşlar. Ben aslında biraz utanıyorum ki yani şimdi Türkçe'de konuşmayacağım, İngilizce'de biraz tembelim. And I'm going to talk today about 4 ways of deconstructing Europe. Can you hear me? Oh, okay, I'm going to have to hold this. Sorry?
Maybe it will be better to use this one.
It feels like Hollywood, getting wired up with the... I'm going to start by looking at one of the extracts in the text. If you look, we're going to start by looking at Catch-22.
Could you use this one to
Okay.
put it? It will be better, I think so.
Okay.
Than using this one.
Okay, are we all okay? Can you all hear me, yeah? Excellent. So I'd like to start by referring to a passage from an American novel, Catch-22, by Joseph Heller. If you'd just like to look at it. That's the kind of God you people talk about, a country bumpkin, a clumsy, bungling, brainless, conceited, uncouth hayseed. Stop it, stop it. What the hell are you getting so upset about, he asked her. I thought you didn't believe in God. I don't, she sobbed, bursting violently into tears. But the God I don't believe in is a good God, a just God, a merciful God. He's not the mean, stupid God you make him out to be. I start out with this ironic moment of religious unbelief from Catch-22, not to make some kind of analogy between a commitment to God and a commitment to Europe, however tempting that may be. The idea, rather, is to illustrate an initial point, that just because something is an illusion doesn't mean it's not true. Although many Europeans don't believe Europe exists in the same way less liminally challenged spaces, such as Iceland or Denmark or France exists, the Europe they don't believe in is a relatively civilized, Christian, enlightened place, distinct from words like Africa or Asia. It's not the originless, sprawling fantasy that some people make it out to be, some people like me. This talk today is not about whether Turkey should join the European Union. The difference between Europe and European Union, basically between a purported continuity of shared cultural and historical values on the one hand, and a single market free trade zone administered by neoliberal economic elites on the other, is so insurmountable as to hopelessly complicate the frame of my very brief talk today. I'm not unaware that one of these signifiers is constantly invoked to deny access to the other. And certainly the ramifications of my talk today will indirectly affect the whole issue of the Turkish entry into the European Union. However, all of the various economic, judicial, party political minutiae surrounding that is going to be another topic for somebody else. Nor is this talk today going to be, nor am I going to deliver a mini history of the word Europa, how it came into being, what it meant at which times for whom, why it began to acquire around the 16th or 17th centuries the kind of currency it did. There's already an endless number of books who have charted this history in a more or less, well, some of them in a celebratory fashion, some of them quite cynically. Obviously, one of the first strategies of deconstruction of the Europe would be almost a Foucauldian historicizing of the evolution of this word, right? Showing what parties profited from its circulation, what kind of discourses it legitimized, and so on and so forth. And clearly, the modern sense of the word has had a relatively recent meaning. In 1529, when the first time Suleiman's armies marched on Vienna, the word Europe does not occur in Luther's text, The War Against the Turk. 150 years later, the second time the Turks are marching on Vienna, the word Europe is all over Leibniz's two essays on the subject. Clearly, in this 150 years, within the space of these 150 years, the word Europe moves from an occasionally used poetic term, much like Albion for England, to a powerful, fully functioning name. Certainly, there's no way I'm going to be able to sort of like look at what happened in these two moments. For Luther, the religious faith of the approaching army was of paramount importance. For Leibniz, in contrast, writing a century and a half later, it was the savagery and ignorance of the Turkish rabble, quote, that Leibniz stressed most. More an enemy of culture than an enemy of Christ. However, disentangling the various strands of the carpet called Europe, as a Christian space, as a democratic space, as a bastion of liberal capitalism and so on and forth, again, is another talk for another day. Now, this talk today is about the deconstruction of the idea of Europe, how one might go about it, how some people have done it in the past, and what possible consequences, if any, might arise from it. I should say at the outset that my use of the word deconstruction is a somewhat conventional one. Although the semantic emptying of a word, the unveiling of a certain infinite elusiveness in a term is a central aspect of Derridian analyses, Today, my talk is going to deal with a much more, I'll be using the term Deconstructing Europe in a much more modest sense. It covers basically any approach, it covers any approach which tries to radically dismantle the idea of Europe as a cultural and civilizational identity, a largely self-enclosed space with a pre-Christian, Christian, and post-Christian secular history, a space which is distinct from its African and Asian shores. Clearly, such an operation could invoke any number of non-Derridian relatives, de-universalizing, decentering, desedimenting, de-Christianizing, even disenchanting, in Weber's sense of showing how a magical term is nothing more than the sum of a collection of processes. So whatever metaphysical abysses, traces of the signifier, or nostalgias for the origin arises from this talk, it's going to be a side effect and not an aim of what I'm going to say. Just let me guzzle some water. Probably the first and most obvious strategy in using any deconstruction of the word Europe would be a re-alienation of its origins. In other words, trying to show how things that we see as emblematically European, St. Augustine, Leonardo da Vinci, Romantic poetry, modernism, actually can be traced back to some very non-European roots. And certainly the word Europe itself will be an excellent springboard to such an approach, as two of its three disputed etymologies do lead us back to the Middle East, either the name of an abducted princess from a city on the coast of Lebanon, present-day Lebanon, or the Proto-Semitic root Erubu, yeah? Which means darkness or descent. In Arabic, we have Maghrib, Arab, yeah? In Hebrew, it's Ma'ariv. The latter, incidentally, a disputed etymology, which, if it possesses any truth, ironically means that both Europe and Arab ultimately spring from the same word. This strategy of reorigination has many variations, either the exposure of the already established, i.e. that the founder of the Western Christian tradition was an African bishop, to perhaps the more speculative, that Dante's Divine Comedy was inspired by Ibni-Arabi, Asympalatheus, or that poetry first came to Europe through the Arabs. That's Juan Andres. One of the most ambitious projects in this respect has been the 3-volume work of Martin Bernal, Black Athena, 1987 to, I think, 1995, which basically argues that a 19th century European Hellenophilia occluded significant Near Eastern and African influence on the formation of ancient Greece. Bernal's widely challenged and controversial work covers a number of disciplines, historical, archaeological, and linguistic, and argues as its central premise that over 60% of words in ancient Greek cannot be explained by Indo-European origins. A lacuna Bernal goes on to fill with Phoenician, Egyptian, and other Afro-Semitic etymologies. If the advantage of reorigination, strategies of reorigination, lies in a certain shock value, relocating the other, an African, an Arab, a Jew, at the heart of the European same can provide a useful, perhaps even catalytic moment of trauma for the political identity, the disadvantage is somewhat subtler. It lies in a possible overestimation of the significance an origin can have for the performance of an identity. This naivety, a skeptic might argue, has two dimensions. First of all, it assumes that the invocation of origins to be the cause and driving force of ideological narratives, rather than their a posteriori after effects. And then secondly, and relatedly, in the conviction of the abiding power of the origin, it overlooks or badly miscalculates the historical staying power of subsequent layers of meaning, even after the origin is proved to be false or illusory. Once a signifier has been set into motion and acquired through time a subsequent cluster of historical connotations around it, will the removal and replacement of the initial point of that signifying chain actually have any effect on the subsequent cluster of meanings which have gathered in its wake? Christian anti-Semites never seem to have been particularly worried about the Jewishness of Jesus, any more than today in the US, racist elements in the Republican Party don't seem to be worried about the anti-slavery origins of their movement. Yeah, the Republican Party ironically started as an anti-slavery party, if you can believe that. So certainly, if we can use Bernal's showcase example, if the name Athens really does refer to the African, the Egyptian rather, Hatanat, temple of the goddess Neat, how much effect will this really have on the pervasive classical power the name Athens still exerts today on many Europeans? The second deconstructive strategy, we could almost term strategies of redesignation or reconfiguration. Basically, these strategies try to undermine the notion of Europe by suggesting alternative configurations of culture and space. The two most obvious examples are the idea of a Mediterranean space, popularized, though by no means initiated, by Pierre Bourdieu, and the idea of Europe as the redescription of Europe as a ridge of northwestern Eurasia or a peninsula of Asia, a familiar idea most recently and systematically developed by the historian J.G.A. Pocock. Bourdieu's work on the family structures and concepts of honor in the Kabyle people of Algeria led him to find structures of similarity in southwestern France, and then later on to concur with other studies made in Greece and Spain. So in this sense, the Mediterranean is no longer a frontier line between Europe and Africa, but rather a sea around which a variety of different cultures and religions share a number of series of common family practices. And in a similar fashion, Pocock's the idea of Europe as being Pocock's redescription of Europe as an appendix to Asia or a peninsula of Asia is interesting insofar as it, through topography, suggests a radically different perspective on the idea of Europe. The idea isn't new. As early as 1725, Nobleau, the French historian Nobleau, was calling Europe a cape of Asia. And the French poet Valéry, often referred to Europe as an appendix of Asia. What Pocock's archipelagic, he actually uses the word archipelagic to describe the British Isles, you know, which as a Brit, I think that's really wonderful. You know, we're so convinced the world rolls around us, and, you know, we're an archipelago of the Eurasian, of the northwest ridge of Eurasia. And what that, I suppose, underscores is not simply how Europe belongs to three continents, not one, but also the historical inability of Europe ever to fully, incontestably designate its eastern border. Such reconfiguration implies the renaming of Europe, either obvious practical names like Mediterranean, perhaps slightly more exotic names like northwestern Eurasia, or perhaps older pre-Christian names from the pre-Christian past for the lands of the West, Amentit, Hesperia, Japheth. Certainly, instead of hoping for some fresh vista of alternatives from this tired old word Europa, these strategies of reconfiguration, they refuse from the word go to play the game of defining Europe, and instead try to imagine what a map would like in which the word Europe had never taken place. There is something quite Wittgensteinian about this refusal to have our cartographical intelligence bewitched by a single name. If such a strategy has a problem, it lies in the belief that an alternative topography might actually dislodge the original one. It's a familiar idea that individuals are capable of responding to two or more identities at the same time. the man who cheers for one city against another at a football match, the man who can feel Italian or Spanish when visiting London, but who will suddenly discover his Europeanness every time he hears the word Islam or Africa on the news report he hears in his car. In a process of identity compartmentalization multilingual people will be familiar with, the provision of alternative topographies, it could be argued, will relativize but not fundamentally remove the identity of a European narrative. A third deconstructive strategy might be termed internal othering. This basically involves moving intimately amongst European writers and thinkers and trying to find moments in which, within Europe, Europeans de-Europeanize and even orientalize their neighbors. The most recent study of this is Roberto Dinotto's Europe in Theory, 2007, which basically which in many ways looks at how British, French, and German perceptions of a lazy Mediterranean South, or pigs, Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Spain, was used in juxtaposition with the idea of an industrious, assertive North, a fundamental tenet in the construction of a European identity. One of the pivotal moments in Dinotto's book is a passage where Montesquieu, the French thinker Montesquieu, is explaining the Italian temperament, and you'll see it in your book here, in your leaflet here. There is, in Italy, a southern wind called Sirocco, which passes through the sands of Africa before reaching Italy. It rules that country. It exerts its power over all spirits. It produces a universal weightiness and slowness. Sirocco is the intelligence that presides over all Italian heads. I used to live in Italy, and every time you asked someone, dove comincia il sud? Where does the south begin? They always said like 20 miles south of their village, you know, like it was always like somewhere else. I mean, alongside this Africanizing of Italy, you could have, there's an endless number of moments you could catalogue, right? You know, Thomas Mann's orientalizing of Venice in Tot und Venedig, Nietzsche's preference for the southern sensuousness of Naples, and his anti-Christian celebration of the Islamic pasts of Sicily and Spain in The Antichrist. And also, not to mention Samir Amin's important reminder that for centuries, the Orthodox Church was seen as an Oriental institution. And quite apart from this kind of intra-European othering on a geographical basis, it's also worth bearing in mind the moments in which radical political movements were also Islam was also used historically in Europe to associate itself with radical political movements. So, for example, Luther said the peasant revolutionary Thomas Müntzer was trying to be his own Turkish emperor, quote unquote. Kant was only one of many people who associated the Anabaptists and their radical communes with Islam. Hegel said Robespierre wanted to be was a kind of Muhammad, while Schlegel drew a line of satanic revolt against Catholic Europe, which began in Mecca, went through Wittenberg and revolutionary Paris, and ended here in Ottoman Istanbul. So, you know, in all of these cases, these studies, this kind of strategy of internal othering tries to dissolve the word Europe by showing how within Europe certain elements are ejected as foreign and un-European. The strongest objection to such strategies of internal othering is probably that they remain, at the end, a gesture inside Europe for Europe. Although the legitimacy of the central signifier is called into question, you could argue that these discussions of Europeanness from the outside largely remain invisible if they're detected at all. No matter how much Europeanness is being discussed within Europe, from the perspective of a Nigerian asylum seeker or a Kurdish immigrant, Fortress Europe remains Fortress Europe. In the same way, internal Israeli schisms remain largely invisible to a Palestinian refugee, or the racial and class tensions within a US platoon is indiscernible to an Iraqi at a checkpoint, you could argue that whatever internal mechanisms are going on within Europe, the various debates about how Europeanness is distributed, bestowed upon, taken away from other Europeans, it's of largely academic significance to those locked outside its gates. Indeed, on the contrary, if these kinds of internal self-differentiations are seen as a definition of a Europeanness, as some scholars claim, then on the contrary, far from dissolving the word Europe, such strategies actually strengthen the word Europe by showing how their internal complexities are in themselves so very European. Another strategy for deconstructing Europe, one which is beginning to gather momentum in post-colonial circles, is strategies of de-universalization or provincialization, following Dipesh Chakrabarty's memorable book, Provincializing Europe, 2007. If the power of a word such as Europe lies in its claim to be the fons et origo of global modernity, then such strategies try to diminish that power by restoring the continent to a more modest place of important region or significant player. Such strategies generally have two aspects. Either they take ideas which are commonly held to be European, secularism, modernity, democracy, human rights, etc., and then they try to discern those ideas in cultures and epochs remote from modern Europe. Certainly, they risk varying degrees of impetuosity and anachronism in doing this. And Orhan Pamuk in the Black Book mocks some of the more reckless versions of these race to the moon narratives. For example, referring to those who claim that Ibni-Arabi was the greatest existentialist of all time, etc., etc. However, a provisionary list of the more careful ones is quite impressive. For example, elements of the modern nation-state in the Asante Empire of pre-colonial West Africa, that's Basil Davidson, Turkish precursors to the Stream of Consciousness novel in 19th century Ottoman texts. I believe the novel referred to is by Berna Moran. The critic is Berna Moran, and the text is Araba Sebdesa. Of course, Ibn Khaldun is endlessly seen as, anachronistically perhaps, as the first author of a secular philosophy of history. South Asia has also been a rich source of proto-modernities. Sheldon Pollock discerning elements of secular historicism in 15th and 16th century Sanskrit treatises, while Amartya Sen in the argumentative Indian, in a more fashionable way, in a more popular way rather, argues for the existence of an extremely lively empirical and skeptical intellectual tradition in the Gupta period of Indian philosophy from the 5th period onwards, from the 5th century onwards. These strategies, for the most part, distinguish themselves from strategies of reorigination insofar as they avoid the development of hypothetical lines of causality. The aim is not to trump Europe here, but rather to show the independent emergence of truths commonly held to be European. The second aspect of such provincializing strategies belongs to historians like Dipesh Chakrabarty and Sherif Mardan. Neither asserting the wholly independent emergence of such ideas, nor simply echoing their uncritical adoption, these thinkers examine periods where some form of European influence indisputably took place. But instead of seeing modernity as something which sort of Europe radiated outwards monodirectionally to the rest of the world, what these histories of 19th century Bengal or 20th century Turkey do is try to delineate a space in which European ideas contributed to the construction of culturally specific alternative modernities. So in the case of Dipesh Chakrabarty, he shows how in 19th century Bengal, Western humanistic notions of compassion towards one fellow man found points of contact and tension with Bengali notions of Şahridiyat, literally being with heart. 19th century Bengali nationalist discourses on women's education invoked notions of male lineage or kula. And similarly, in Istanbul, Sherif Mardan shows how the advance of secularization in the Kemalist period was a much more complex process. It wasn't simply a pouring of French laïcité into Turkish vessels, but rather involved the use of religious institutions. For example, many of half of the legal experts who wrote the 1926 Turkish secular constitution had been teaching Islamic Sharia law a few years before. So in other words, no tug of war between bearded mullahs on the one hand and Voltaire reading, opera-going, racquet-drinking secularists on the other, but rather a much more complex response to European ideas from a number of very different quarters. Such historical revisions of European history such historical revisions of European influence provincialize Europe by downgrading it from basically from the status of a disseminator of universality to a region which, through its early discovery of scientific processes, acquired a military edge which enabled it to export its habits and customs around the planet. And it's this ontological demoting of Europe from origin to influence to factor, which is probably the closest we come today to the God analogy that I suggested at the beginning of this talk. The murder of the myth of Europe as the primum mobile, the prime mover of global modernity, it could be argued, finally allows other countries to breathe. By disenchanting this word Europe of its magical ubiquity, by removing what Chakrabarty calls the first in Europe then elsewhere structure of global historical time, it will cause a certain structure to recede and leave in its wake a polycentered space where other countries can finally begin the project, the difficult task of rethinking themselves historically. Certainly, in terms of Europe, however, it remains unclear how successful such strategies are. I think, do you mind? I'm just going to grab another bit of water. Certainly, the main drawback in this case seems to be the sudden opacity which Europe acquires whenever it moves outside Europe. So, particularly in the re-examination of colonial encounters, the confluence of British, French, and Portuguese forces in an Asian or an African setting would seem to resurrect and reify notions of Europeanness, even in the very moment that one is trying to deconstruct them. And certainly the irony of Europe constantly having to rely on its invariably colonial relationship to non-Europe in order to continuously perform and define itself, I mean, that's a familiar irony. But here, in provincializing Europe, in retribalizing Europeans as the only clan that doesn't know it's a clan, it does run the risk of lending an originally illusory word an external consistency. Even in the search for pre-European, non-European pre-contact notions of modernity, the spectre of Europe lingers, yeah? Even in the very threatened moment of its dissolution. It does so in the sense that, it does so, I think, in the way these kinds of strategies bring with them a pre-understanding in Heidegger's sense of Vorverständnis, a tacit and utterly unarticulated presupposition which structures the analysis and guides the gaze in order to lead it in a certain direction. So to look for notions of the nation-state in West Africa, or to look for secularism in the court of the Hafsids, in a way is already to keep Europe invisibly at the center of one's quest. The fifth and final strategy I'm going to talk about today could be termed collaborative strategies or strategies of commonality. Such approaches have a number of characteristics. They are invariably historical in nature. They usually invoke identity on a religious basis. And they usually have as a target the idea of a Christian Europe. Strategies of commonality try to de-Christianize the idea of Europe by finding ideas, practices, beliefs which spill across geographical and religious borders. They're distinguished from strategies of reconfiguration insofar as they don't suggest a more accurate space or signifier into which Jews, Muslims, or Christians could be reincorporated. And I'm going to read this list out to you, but there's quite a few people doing this, yeah? Particularly looking at the kinds of activities and practices which bridge Muslims and Christians, we have intermarriage, that's Anthony Breyer, homosexual love, Ross Brand, weapons use in manufacture, MC Bartusis, superstitious practices, Michel Balivet, even criminality, Brian A. Catlas. It's wonderfully moving, I find, that in 10th and 11th century Spain, Muslim criminals and Christian criminals overcame their common differences to rob other Muslims and Christians of their... that's a joke, I'm sorry. I should be aware of irony. But, I mean, this is basically what they're trying to do. They're trying to sort of find sort of trans-religious differences which create sort of perhaps new identities. Wider approaches include, for example, cultural and military collaborations in larger entities, for example, Tsarist Russia, Robert Crewe's most recent book on For Profit and for Tsar, and even of the Ottoman Empire, Heath Lowry, Jamal Kafadar. There's even a historian, Kitsikis, who argues that the first 100 years of the Ottoman Empire should really be called the Greek or Turkish Empire. The symbolic impact such cross-faith collaborations can have is quite striking. If you take the example of military collaborations for it, and if you look at the sheet, the map in front of you, you'll see this is just a small selection of battlefields across Europe. Genuinely, just a small selection. Can you all see it? You should all have a map. This is just a small selection of moments where Muslims and Christians actually fought on the same side, very often against other Muslim Christians. Yeah? This could be Venetians and Turks. It could be Tartars and Ukrainians. It could be Catholics and Sunni Muslims. And I suppose if I'm going to select one for attention, it would be, probably one of the most significant on that map, would be the Siege of Vienna, 1683. The Siege of Vienna is probably one of the most commemorated moments where, allegedly, the armies of Islam gathered to storm the gates of Christendom. In 2004, when Turkey was negotiating its entry into the European Union, 2 out of 3 Austrians were against the idea. The symbolic value of this event still is quite strong in the Austrian political memory. The liberal weekly Profil, even the liberal weekly Profil, had an editorial, Die Türken am Windtor, the Turks at the gates of Vienna. What few Austrians realize is that for most Christians in the Balkans, the Catholic Habsburgs were every bit as much of an imperialist presence as the Ottomans. And when the Turks marched on Vienna, they were accompanied, marching alongside them, by over 100,000 Hungarian Protestants. Even the Ottoman army itself was far from being wholly Muslim. As the historian Barker points out, apart from obviously the Muslim contingent, Turks, Arabs, Kurds, you had Bulgars, Armenians, Serbs, Lithuanians, Romanians, Greeks, and not to mention a whole host of Western renegades. The Hungarian army would work separately. It conducted its operation mostly to the north in present-day Slovakia, marching on Bratislava, working in close conjunction with Kur Hussein Pasha. If we are to take as a number of 100,000 for the Hungarian contingent, and of 100 and 120,000 for the Ottoman army, which included 12,000 Moldovan, Wallachian, Christian auxiliaries, then one fact becomes clear. Over half of the Turkish army marching on Vienna were Christians. How successful are such strategies of historical revision? The philosopher Husserl said that the idea of Europe was unrelated to the empirical history of Europe. in his 1935 lecture on the crisis of Europe, Husserl argued that in order for a crisis to take place, a concept first had to be seen as pure. So if purity is a precondition of a crisis, and if crises are how identity continually affirms and reperforms itself, then the idea of a pure Christian continent or a wholly Christian past almost requires the adulteration, the presence of impure elements in order to sustain itself. Perhaps this is what undermines the secret logic. Perhaps it's this secret logic, actually, which undermines the success of strategies of collaboration, of commonality. Because of all the strategies we've talked about today, these are the most, strategies of commonality are the most widespread and the oldest. The 1,000-year-old convivencia of Jews, Muslims, and Christians around the shores of Mediterranean is no hidden truth or elusive reality. Yeah? It's an open secret. It's been an open secret in modern scholarship for decades, the intermingling of these groups in food, in faith, in war, in literature. The empirical fact that half of the Turkish army marching on Vienna was Christian, that countries like the Ukraine or Spain or Sicily were Catholic, were Muslims for centuries before they were Catholic or Orthodox, that in the time of Dante, thousands of Arab soldiers fought for their Christian empire by the walls of Bologna and Milan. These facts do not challenge the idea of a Christian Europe in the slightest, for they have no substance or permanence in the self-unfolding advancement of the idea of Europe. When Tal al-Assad, I mean, their role is both ancillary and invisible. When Tal al-Assad writes how Muslims are at both absent and present in Europe, it is precisely this duality he is addressing. Islam is dialectically invisible in Europe. And it must remain so in order for Europe to take place. If Muslims were to become opaque as living, thinking, historically significant and actual human beings, the self-differentiating movement of Europe itself would stall. For this reason, it could be argued, strategies of commonality largely fail. They fail because they see the problem as an external issue, as an external epistemological issue. You know, facts to be provided, complexities to be unveiled, new evidence to be discovered, and fail to understand, fail to enter the interiority of the European game, fail to try and understand why Europeans need words like Europe. They fail to move into the inner mechanism of the European mindscape, you know, it's precisely this mindscape of cathedrals, frescoes, libraries, museums, which persists because of impure elements, not merely despite them. To try and convince such a dedicated European that Islam is part of Europe by showing endless numbers of historical collaborations and cultural coexistence and so on and so forth is like trying to improve the poor reception of a TV set by wiping the screen with a cloth. Strategies of commonality then ultimately fail because they see all the important things to be done that are on the outside, you know, facts to recheck, narratives to revise, new evidence to push forward. Anyway, I'm going to end with three consequences here, okay? Three sort of possible consequences of the deconstruction of Europe. The first effect might well be a dissolution of the term the Muslim world. How am I doing for time, by the way? Should I sort of, are we okay? The first effect might be the dissolution of the term Muslim world, Dar al-Islam. If we are going to deconstruct a Christian Europe, then the notion of a Muslim non-Europe, a Muslim North Africa, a Muslim Levant, yes, even a Muslim Turkey, will also have to share the same fate. For many scholars, I think this won't be much shocking news. almost 20 years ago now, Aziz al-Esme told us how there are as many Islams as there are situations that sustain it. And certainly much more recently, scholars like Jamil Aydin have been historicizing quite effectively the term Muslim world, tracing its political genealogy back to the mid-19th century. If the territoriality of religious belief is what is questioned when we deconstruct Christian Europe, then for Muslim countries, a whole range of repressed non-Muslim pasts are going to rise to the surface. For some, this will be comfortable. For some, it will be not so comfortable. But regardless of whether we're talking about Moroccan Jews, Druze, Lebanese Catholics, Turkish Armenians, North African Greeks, the fact remains that if we are going to the deconstruction of the de-Christianization of the space called Europe is going to involve a collateral de-Islamization of the space called the Middle East. A second possible consequence is that the word Europe will continue to linger, but in a kind of spectral fashion, in a crossed-out fashion, as Derrida would say, sur rature. In a weakened fashion, semantically weakened enough to be able to extend its borders across the Mediterranean to countries on the other shore. Certainly the dilemmas involved in any weakening of European spirit are familiar enough already. You know, on the one hand, on the positive side, an increasing openness towards the non-European, but on the negative side, perhaps the rise of previously checked ethno-nationalisms within Europe. The fate of the former Yugoslavia often being given as a kind of warning to the perils of anti-Europeanness. Such a deconstructed Europe would lose some of its Christianness, lose some of its synonymy with modernity, lose some of its uniqueness as a torchbearer of the Enlightenment, but would gain a more eastward-looking aspect and certainly would gain a more Mediterranean feel. And the entry of Turkey into the European Union, aside from the thorny question of who exactly would profit from such a relationship, would be a significant step in that direction. Finally, this is my final point, the third possible after effect of a deconstructed Europe might be a completely terminal one, the disappearance of the word Europe itself. Before anyone laughs, I should remind them that entities much larger than Europe and much longer in duration have long since sunk into oblivion. The Soviet Union, an empire stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific, 6 times the size of modern Europe, lasted for 7 decades, whilst the Holy Roman Empire, the Heilige Römisches Reich, a German Latin kingdom at its peak stretching from the Baltic to Sicily, lasted nearly 1,000 years before its ultimate dissolution in 1806. Both of these names now, for better or for worse, live on only in museums. Certainly the modern Europe we invoke every time we want to welcome, block, deport, or nurture non-Europeans, it's a relatively young word. We've only had it for about 400 years. Why did we think such a name was going to last forever? Yeah, nothing lasts forever. Certainly, in a recent book by Norman Davies entitled Vanished Kingdoms, Davies looks at the number of kingdoms within Europe which are now no more. And apart from the oddities and eccentricities, the one-day kingdom of Racine in Carpatha, Ukraine, or the brief Visigoth kingdom of Toulouse in western France, there are certainly much more substantial entities which now don't exist. For example, the Polish-Lithuanian kingdom of Zespolita, which in the time of its founding, 1569, was the largest state in Europe. The state of Burgundy, which lasted for over 1,300 years before its eventual absorption into western France. All of these names, once endowed with the power to summon armies and govern vast tracts of land, are now no more. The possibility that Europe may succumb in a similar fashion to a more powerful name, a secret name belonging to the future, a name we today cannot possibly envisage, is a possibility only those indifferent to history will rule out. Thank you. I'm going to sit down here now.
I hope everyone hears me. Jan Almond's speech brings us face to face with a bunch of significant questions which are interwoven with each other. Clearly, Almond is a thinker who likes to exceed the commentator's style that my job as a respondent imposes upon me. The title of his paper is 5 Ways to Deconstruct Europe. The term deconstruction is here used rather loosely, therefore it is not worth comparing Almond's use of the term with the term as introduced by Derrida's early works. Nevertheless, the question arises as to what deconstruction may mean in the political context. And this, I believe, is a fundamental question in Derrida's late works. In Force of Law, Derrida had set the practice of deconstruction in relation with the idea of justice. Certainly, Derrida believed in the deconstruction of institutions in order to denounce why and how they are unjust, what is problematic in them. And why do we speak of the deconstruction of Europe today? Well, because Europe, as it is in the present, betrays its philosophical idea. Let us recall what was this idea all about. But that brings us to what an idea can mean to the existence of a continent such as Europe. Perhaps the most important question to which Almond's essay lead us to is the question of the existence of Europe. It seems that there is such a thing as Europe. It is a historical, geographical, political fact that no one would be willing to deny. Nevertheless, there is a specific nature to this fact. It has a certain strangeness and oddity, so to speak. For Europe is also something less than real, not a fact, but also an idea, a phantasm, a product of imagination, an illusion, and a fantasy. What could history mean if one did not have a philosophy of history, an idea of history, with the double genitive familiar to the continental tradition? That ideas precede realities in politics is a simple truth that does not reduce to the manipulation of symbols. I hear a tone of disappointment in Jan Almond's way of addressing the question of the existence of Europe, for he seems to be saying that it's now hard to believe in good Europe. I believe we need to look at the idea of Europe as a philosophical idea in order to see why. At the first quarter of the 20th century, the founder of phenomenology, Edmund Husserl, had explicitly raised the question of the essence of Europe. What does European ethos as such consist of? The question has marked both the crisis of the European sciences and the origin of geometry. More than 50 years later, in 1992, the same question has been taken up by Jacques Derrida in the other heading. The text is the site of a response at the time of the creation of the European Union, for it provides a reflection on how Europe should be constituted. Although the conditions in which Husserl and Derrida carried their reflections were quite different, the essential issue they discussed, the exemplarity of Europe, remained the same. Europe was under the threat of Nazism when Husserl tried to say that Europe's essence is the phenomenological attitude of going back to the things themselves in order to clarify the origins of our scientific knowledge. In other words, the idea of Europe meant for him being critically in touch with the most primordial experiences. It referred to a certain attitude or practice of philosophy, more than identification through the appropriation of an historical philosophical heritage. What mattered to Husserl was the willingness to take the philosophical attitude, and responsibility for the tradition did not amount to identification through time. This is where Husserl located the exemplarity of Europe with regard to other cultures. The essence of Europe did not consist in the manner in which people appeared, their clothing, their lifestyle, the way they dwelt, built cities, the technology they used, the way they wrote, their use of a specific phonetic alphabet, and their measurements of the objective time and space. In contrast with the idea of Europe, as perceived by Kemalism, The European ethos, according to Husserl, did not have anything to do with such contingent features of the European lifestyle. It meant reflectivity and the capacity for the philosophical attitude. Now let us turn to Derrida, in the other heading. There, Derrida takes into account Husserl's way of conceiving the European ethos, even though he adds something very different to it. The idea of Europe is now defined by two constituent elements. Firstly, the responsibility for sense, responsibility for the inherited body of knowledge, and secondly, the openness to the other. Although these two elements are primordial, the second has played a determining role in Derrida's conception of Europe. He fantasized about Europe as having permeable borders that others may cross. It is worth asking if the relation at stake here is nothing more than hospitality, a hospitable relation to the other. I think I ought to be hospitable to the foreigner who visits my country and lives temporarily in my house, under my rules, my laws. Or has Derrida intended more than that? I believe this is indeed the case. We can interpret Derrida as saying that it will be fundamentally wrong, irresponsible to imagine Europe on the basis of a particular race, a historical culture, a religion. Europe should be the name of a pluralistic and democratic space. It is as if in reforming the idea of Europe as an ethical idea, in fashioning Europe as ethical relation to the other, Derrida made possible to imagine the European space in terms of the peaceful coexistence of three Abrahamic religions. My friend Ahmet Demirhan, who is the organizer of this encounter, and a Derridian as well, wanted me to address the issue of how we imagine Europe from here, that is from Istanbul, from Turkey. Now I think that more than the Husserlian component of the idea of Europe, we imagine Europe from here through the second component. Is there any evidence for that? I gather that for the last 10 years, there have been a lot of efforts for a religious dialogue. And I do not know what concrete results have been obtained by such efforts. Seen from a distance, they seem to be quite ineffective at the face of the rising racism in Europe against Islam. We have said at the beginning that Europe betrayed its philosophical idea, for it has identified with a particular religion, that is Christianity, with a particular race, white European race. It builds itself around an identity which excludes others, and as a consequence, it has lost its persuasiveness at the symbolic level. Europe's predominance, preeminence, primacy is becoming more and more fragile. Our symbolic universe is becoming less and less Eurocentric, as it is hard to find anyone who speaks in praise of Europe. Various practices of deconstruction that Jan Almond has brought together in his 5 ways gather those strategies that were operative in interrupting the European identification. What are these ways? Let me give a brief summary now. The first deconstruction realienates origins. It shows that things which are considered emblematic of Europe have in fact some non-European origins. This deconstruction attempts to show that in fact the origins are elsewhere. It relocates the other at the heart of the same. The shortcoming of this deconstruction is found in the belief in the abiding power of the origin. In believing this, I quote, it overlooks or badly calculates the historical staying power of subsequent layers of meaning, even when the origin is revealed to be false or illusory, end of quote. The second deconstruction consists of a redesignation or reconfiguration of space and culture to the effect of renaming. The question appears as to how effective this deconstruction is. It is not clear if this strategy would undermine the narrative of European identity. The third way of deconstruction consists of internal othering, Europeans' de-Europeanization, orientalizations of their neighbors, for example, the Africanization of the Italians. The fourth deconstruction aims at de-universalization or provincialization. It shows that some ideas and traditions that are considered to be European are also found elsewhere, thus undermining the positing of Europe as the disseminator of universality. The independent emergence of truths in different parts of the world implies that Europe is just a province of that emergence. Fifthly, the strategies of commonality, if different beliefs, alliances, and cultural practices are also found elsewhere, they are not specifically Christian. Thus, the emphasis on what is common brings about a de-Christianization of Europe. I think from Almond's 5 ways of deconstructing Europe, it follows that a de-Christianization of Europe is necessary. But he also argues that this is inseparable from a de-Islamization of those parts of the world that identify through Islam in exclusionary ways. As Europe is retreating to itself, to its own identity, it fortifies racist trends that are inherent to it. Contemporary European racism does not so much target the Jew, but the Muslim. Racism is going to haunt Europe even more if Europe is conceived as having to do with rigidifying the boundaries set to the other. It will look like a closed space for some antiquity, the site or a shelter for a threatened identity. Let me tell you about what I recently saw at Basel Airport. On the glass cabinet of the border police, one read, "The Republic could only be lived with an open face." The representation of niqab and burqa as undermining the principles of the French Republic shows the extent to which the other is perceived as a threat to French Republican identity. Now in France, most people's votes are shaped by such manipulative discourses, and they cast doubt on Europe as a democratic space. Threat to one's existence or identity is the determining affection to be found at the existential ground of all nationalisms. Those who retreat to their identity lack transcendence, a relation to the other that could have given rise to new universals. Indeed, now Europe is not a Judeo-Christian space. According to good Hegelian logic, this will be a space that is defined by what it excludes, that's to say, Islam. Europe is now defined by its objection of Islam. And when identification becomes objection and exclusion, there is no ethical relation to the other. The logic of objection is now being constitutive of Europe. It pervades its real politics, Europe as technocracy, programming, calculation, and manipulation of opinions. This is obviously a failure of both Husserl's and Derrida's ideas of Europe, and certainly it calls for deconstruction. Thank you.
Well, I've talked so much, so I'm just going to reply briefly to your excellent response. To begin with, the idea of a good Europe, I don't know if, maybe I expressed it badly, because I'm not sure if I had a nostalgia for a good Europe at all, but certainly, as a good socialist, alhamdulillah, I'm a soldier, I guess, like, for me, over the past 20 years, the rise of neoliberalism, the way the original Erasmus-like project of cosmopolitanism, and also, let's be fair, at least, you know, in the 70s and 80s, there was an element, a strong emphasis on social justice. And I remember in the UK, originally, wanting to go into the EU, or what it was then was the EEC, would have meant minimum wage and so on and so forth. For me, that has evaporated. And what we have today, and I'm sorry to lapse into cliches, but what we have today really is just a collection of business elites, and increasingly a society in the European Union where the most fundamental decisions that we make are handed over to economic. So it's that. If there's any nostalgia there, it is that. And it's not so much nostalgia as fear. And then secondly, I suppose, like, looking at Derrida and looking at the whole notion of the idea of Europe as being somehow synonymous with this idea towards the other, this sort of like European openness towards the tout autre and so on and so forth, which I really like. But I suppose, even though on many I'm not sort of crazy about Foucault, but one of the things I find lacking in that analysis is that to some extent it overlooks the appalling irony that the continent which has given us free thinking, cosmopolitanism, this wonderful sort of liberation and sort of like tolerance for the other over 2 centuries, simultaneously was the most imperialistic part of the planet over the same time period. And it cannot, instead of seeing a contradiction from that, I really feel, like Said, that there is a logic there, a dark and perverse logic between, and I don't want to hop across the Atlantic, but just for a moment, even in the US, what strikes me again and again is like within the US, you know, freedom and justice are such foregrounded ideals. And yet, and I really don't think it's in defiance of, I think there is a perverse, almost inverse logic by which this is a country which murders and brutalizes and bombs other parts of the planet. And for me at least, in that I see the foregrounding of this idea of openness in a slightly sinister aspect here. I think there's something quite sinister. And then sort of like coming on to your point about nobody seems to speak in praise of Europe. I mean, I think it's really different where we're talking from, because I can completely, I lived here 6 years and I completely, know what the MHP and all the various people say about Europa, bize istemiyor and all this lot. But in Europe, I assure you, the degree of uncritical adulation and self-assurance of Europe, it never fails to strike me. For example, when Europeans talk about the US, and of course we know the US are bastards, but when they talk about US foreign policy in the Middle East, you would think neither France nor the UK ever had anything to do with the Middle East, And certainly in many ways, I find Europe as the economic imperialism of Europe much more, almost as, well, possibly more dangerous than the explicit imperialism of the US. In the 90s, what did the European Union do? It forced North African countries to liberalize their economies and then dumped their subsidized grain on them, destroying local markets. How is that not murder? How is that not a silent, gradual genocide? And yet, I bet you not even 1 in 10 people would know about that. But those are economic B-52s. And that is really where my gut feelings about, my resentment towards this word Europe comes from. And I realize that here in a Turkish context, there are different connotations here. And I don't sit easily next to like someone like the MHP or something. But you see where I'm coming from here, yeah? I mean, those are the 2, I had 2 more, but I was going to...
Yes. I tried because we are using this term deconstruction, and this is how the whole encounter is framed. So I felt like going back to this Husserlian strategy of Europe as responsibility for sense, and wanted to say that this didn't have any aspect that had to do with identification through history, through appropriation of the cultural heritage. It was something else than that. So it worked quite differently than in Hegel, for example. There is this rethinking of the European ethos as an opening to the other, I think gave another aspect to this idea of Europe as responsibility. Okay, so not only responsibility for sense, but also responsibility in this sense of relation to the other, openness to the other. But I agree with the way in which cosmopolitanism can be problematic. because you know, in Kant, for example, you see it. He's the inventor of cosmopolitanism, but at the same time, you see him having a quite problematic and racist relation to blacks. So racism and cosmopolitanism can be found together, and that didn't face with the fact sufficiently. I completely agree with you. But still, this ethical relation to the other, this revision of the idea, helped us to imagine Europe as pluralistic and as not this only site for a particular religion, but as just like in the Middle Ages, more interaction in between religions. I think this is how Europe was, how we imagined Europe from here, but it turned out to be a failure as more and more right-wing and racist discourses have become prominent in Europe. And this is also visible here, as well as from within Europe as well. Just like watching what happens in French elections right now and the role the radical right plays, and how, you know, burqa, niqab, headscarf, what kind of role does that play in the political discourses in France right now, and the exclusion, I mean, the threatened European identity. I think that dominates Europe right now. And so rather than a philosophical idea, it's like a Stimmung being threatened by the other. Rather than ethical relation to the other, this fear of the other dominates the ordinary European, the way ordinary European relates to who he is.
But I guess that's kind of like where I put my Marxist hat on.
Right.
Right. Because I mean, what's interesting, like with the burqa thing you talked about, and also this coexistence of like cosmopolitanism and racism, this eerie, uncanny coexistence between the two in the same topos.
Right.
Like, what's happening in Europe at the moment is like you have these conflicts emerging between, if you like, monocultural capital and multicultural capital. Yeah. Right. So I mean, you do have like monocultural narratives, not just European, but also nationalist, yeah, which is about our jobs, I mean, even in Greece, just this week you've seen this, yeah, you have like, it's interesting how the anti-austerity votes are splitting either to far-right parties or far-left. So you have these like monocultural narratives, and then also you have like right-wing, centre-right politicians like, well, Sarkozy, but Merkel and Cameron, who, when they're in problems, play to these monocultural.
Right.
But then you also have multicultural capital. So basically, for me, I see a tension there between monocultural bastions of monocultural conservatisms, but then an increasing and emerging multicultural capitalism, which just wants to keep the machine running. It doesn't care what colour the machine is. It doesn't care whether it prays to, you know, Greek church or a Jami. It doesn't really care, as long as, you know, 1% of the people keep controlling 42% of the wealth. Whatever it takes, just keep the machine running. Yeah. And to some extent, multiculturalism as the lubricant of late capitalism is certainly in some aspects of European society.
And maybe this can add as the sixth way of deconstruction.
Right.
Which, you know, it's great that now you're, I think, complementing your exposition, because when I read your paper and read about these 5 ways of deconstruction, it, you know, struck me that the word a critique of neoliberalism was missing from your presentation, and now it emerged, and I think it's the fundamental. You know, it should be the fundamental way of deconstructing Europe, right?
I mean, but at that point we get into the familiar criticisms of Derrida. Because for me, when I present these 5 ways, I mean, it wasn't a Thomist 5 or anything, but when I present these 5, sorry, are we? Oh, I'm sorry, okay. Can I just briefly say that I wasn't endorsing them like I was just, anyway.
After that, your comments that we will start to for the Q&A session.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, please.
No, I was just going to...
We can talk, take questions, right?
Yeah. Actually, that we will start to the Q&A Q&A session to take maybe the fifth, sixth had already begun, and maybe the seventh or the eighth will become shorter questions. It's fine. Please, all questions. Professor. I think you
I moderate. Okay.
Thank you both. These were really wonderful talks. Jan, maybe I have misheard you, but when you referred to Aziz Al-Asmah's work, his pluralization of Islam, you know, when I first read his book and when I...
This is Islam's and Modernities, isn't it?
Yes. When I first read that book, I thought that precisely the argument that you should make against him is deconstruction, because he takes the question of identity so lightly. If there is no Islam, what's the point of fighting Islamophobia? Just like we said to feminists, if there is no woman, what's the point of fighting patriarchy? There is, of course, Islam. There is, of course, an essence of Islam, because for many people who have been living it all over the world, even though they have been living it in different ways as we see them, they are still living something that they call Islam. So I think the question of essence, especially in the way Derrida approaches it, you know, is a lot more complicated than Aziz's rather easy solution to the problem, I thought. But of course, I understand your argument as something that comes within certain kind of context. You want to make a certain pluralization of Islam, maybe. But I think the question is a lot more complicated than that.
No,
the other thing is, I forgot what I was going to say. You know, deconstruction, I mean, is a word that's being used, and Europe as well is a word that's being used in all kinds of ways, and you have just shown us a couple of ways it's being shown. Europe, you know, until quite recently in this country, you know much better than me, Europe was this word, this proper name was almost identical to democracy.
So
that if you criticize...
Could you say that again? Europe, when was it almost identical to democracy?
Well, until quite recently.
Could you give a year?
Especially in the very conjuncture way when the first AKP government was making a move, in their first coming to government, they make the first move towards the European Union. And the negotiations were going to start, etc., etc. I mean, at that moment, Europe, and even before that, for quite a long time, within left circles, liberal circles, Europe was identical to democracy. So that if you criticize, for instance, anything European or anything about EU, you would have to pay a price for that. I mean, you couldn't make this argument. If you make this argument, which you did, about North Africa, for instance, let's say 10 years ago in Turkey, you know, in an environment where you had just like a community like this, you would get some criticism from a few people, to say the least. So the word is taken in so many different senses, and Derrida is taking it to, I think, in a very singular kind of sense, in the other heading, and perhaps deconstruction is a lot more practical kind of thing. This is no criticism of your intervention, Zeynep, but 5 years ago, Gayatri Spivak came here and gave a talk, and without making any kind of theoretical formulation, at least not in relation to deconstruction, she just said, instead of European Muslims, which is the usual expression, she just said Muslim Europeans, which is such a turn of things, as you can imagine. Suddenly those people become Europeans in the first place. And of course, that's also a kind of implicit kind of reference to Gayatri Spivak's, if you think of her general argument that migrants are upwardly mobile, and we shouldn't forget that. I mean, that's a kind of expression which sort of covers the whole field of, migrant population, relationship to the other, etc., etc. And I think that shows that deconstruction is actually a very practical kind of operation that you just do. All this is said, of course, in the spirit of your talk, which I think is also a very practical take on deconstruction. Thank you.
Thank you. Just to answer 2 points. First of all, with Aziz Al-Azmi, you kind of said what I wanted to say yourself, that basically I wasn't endorsing any of the various positions that he takes in Islam and modernities, but I was just, I think one of the things I like about Aziz Al-Azmi that he was arguing for a plurality within Islam, and that was like the minor point in thing. And then secondly, you made quite a few points, but I just wanted, because of time short, I just want to take you up with the last one about the practicality of deconstruction. To be honest, I was presenting these arguments today without endorsing them. I'm a post-Derridian. I guess I'm kind of like a lapsed Catholic. I go through the practices of deconstruction, but I'm not sure I believe it anymore. And I think, because I still get deconstruct texts and that, I'll be really honest, I don't see, I do feel that, and I guess there's an element of Zizek in this, I do feel that the late capitalist society in which we live today has deconstruction as its default mode. And that, for me, calls into question exactly how really practical deconstruction is. I think it's Wittgenstein who says philosophy leaves everything as it is, untouched. And I to some extent, I do feel that about deconstruction. And towards the end, perhaps if you notice, I got a little cynical because, deconstructing these things is all well and good, but there comes a moment where perhaps it's not just enough simply to rename people. Yeah, renaming people Muslim Europeans and that. I'm not denying the symbolic reality of the powerful symbolic reality that can affect. But we've got to start physically blocking things, occupying things, disrupting things. I don't think it's going to be enough simply to go with the deconstructive idea that language is a tool by which we can. That's one of the reasons why I'm not sure I have as much faith in the practicality of deconstruction as I used to have. And I understand, I'm not, because I do understand the spirit of what you're saying, but am I coming across here, or am I coming across, do you understand what I'm saying? Okay.
I think you said something very interesting, or so I understood, because on the 5th item of deconstruction, you said the concept of Europe may disappear when or you jump to the example of Holy Roman Empire. So my conclusion is that so long as these two two faces of the perhaps concept, that's a physical reality of an administrative union and economic power, and this cultural or civilizational naming that it takes onto itself, I saw a kind of linking between those two in that 5th item that you were talking about. So I understood as if you were saying that so long as there is a political will and a material power, economic and military power, to articulate the existence of a Europe and Europeanness, it will live on. And quite frankly, I read a somehow pessimistic tone in your lecture also, sort of implying that without perhaps this reality, all attempts at deconstructing will sort of kind of fade into insignificance, almost some sort of apologetics that doesn't mean so much. So what I want to just connect it is with your description of deconstructing the idea of Europe and deconstructing the idea of Islam, sort of a critique of perhaps a concept of civilization. But I want to just ask you, how do you deal with the fundamental asymmetry between these discourses? Because when we talk about
which discourses?
The discourses of Europe versus Islam, For example, if we can still talk about a certain economic and political power that is superior to the other sides of the world, our trying to deconstruct the concept of Europe will have to be fundamentally different from deconstructing the concept of Islam, because a discourse can not be understood without the point of articulation. So, so I'm just asking, would this way of struggling with the concepts be somehow related to the way the idea of Europe is articulated now, as opposed to its articulations in the past? For example, the shift from hierarchical ordering of races and stuff like that to differential culturalism. So it brings me to the framework of Foucault and Said once again. So what do you say?
Well, yeah, I mean, basically, like, when we look at, for me, when we talk about these symbolic narratives, because you've expressed that very well, this belief in a Europe and then the kind of material circumstances and the various, and I'm thinking now not just of Europe, but also all these kinds of various ideological and symbolic narratives that are being passionately embraced. I guess, again, I am kind of cynical about that. I do feel that if there is a material link between the mindscape of Europe or the mindscape of an Islamic world, or even sort of like the kind of ideological narratives about the United States, I do see them to some extent, and I'm not a vulgar Marxist, warning line, but I do see them to some extent as distraction machines, yeah? Because it's really no massive irony that some of the, if you look in so many different contexts, whether it's the Tea Party movement in the US, whether it's sort of British National Front, the British movement, neo-fascist Brits, whether it's really for the poorest of the poor here in Turkey, this passionate, libidinal investment in these imaginal mindscapes is sometimes almost mathematically inverse to how much they actually materially possess in reality, right? The people, you know, there's almost a mathematically inverse relationship between the amount of energy they put into these mindscapes and how actually materially invested they are that these structures should persist. And at that point, for me, it's difficult not to be cynical and say something's wrong here. So instead of trying to, okay, not instead of, but I don't think it's merely enough to semantically attack these narratives and try to discount them. I really feel that materially, if you want to, for example, if you want to get rid of xenophobia and Islamophobia in Europe, we need material, serious redistribution of resources and wealth. It's boring, it's mundane, it's cliched, I know, but it's only when you have a more fairer dispersal of economic opportunities in societies that levels of tension go down, and that the currency of Islamophobia on both sides of the Atlantic down. You won't get rid of it, but it seriously ebbs when people feel they are participating in the society and are economically profiting from it in the same way other people around them are. So in a way, I am giving a sort of very materialist response to you. And again, that is kind of like a consequence of some of my disenchantment with a deconstructive vocabulary. But I just want to emphasize the fact that that doesn't mean we shouldn't semantically engage with the symbolic order, because that, you know, obviously that has a tremendous effect as well.
Maybe I wasn't able to follow you properly. I might be doing a bit injustice to your arguments, but if so, please let me know. But I felt like I couldn't see the trace of deconstruction in your analysis. What I saw was a criticism of Europe historically and in its current form, but I'm not sure whether this is deconstruction or not. The reason why I'm saying this is because of this. If we're going to follow the Derridian spirit here, it's I must underline that, yes, of course, we must criticize Islamophobia. I think Islamophobia is a light word. We must criticize the new racist thinking in Europe. And as we are criticizing the new racist formation there, we need to go back to the whole privileging of the Holocaust and its relation with the Islamophobia. What kind of a special dynamic is going on with the privileging of the Holocaust as Europe's only racist history, and how this functions as an alibi to justify the new racist thinking in Europe. So that's one issue. So I'm all with you in that criticism. But if we are loyal to the deconstructive gesture, we must also carry on the legacy of Europe. It's not enough simply to dispense with the idea of Europe. I mean, the other heading also shows us how we cannot simply abandon the things that we inherit with the Enlightenment: freedom, liberty, so on and so forth. So these are not simply ideas that we can disregard. So what does it mean to inherit that history? That history involves both the dirty side, the dirty colonial violence, as well as the Enlightenment idea that we cannot do without. So this aspect is what I wasn't able to find in your deconstruction of Europe.
But do you feel there was a relationship between that dirty side and the Enlightenment side?
That's the other side of the Enlightenment, but as we
That's a pretty big thing to say, though, because then if you're asking us to keep the legacy of Europe, what kind of legacy are you asking us to keep?
Yes, this is precisely the point. Derrida's argument about what does it mean to inherit, I think, is a very important question. You inherit. What we do is we inherit this history as Europeans, right? So to inherit a history does not mean to simply repeat it. It brings a responsibility, he says. You have to respond to that history. To respond to that history, to be responsible for that history, is that you inherit it, but it doesn't mean to simply repeat it. It also means to, this is the whole idea about iteration. You repeat it, but you change it. So that's the responsibility there. It brings that double, it has this double bind.
Right.
So that's what I wasn't able to trace in your talk.
I mean, certainly, like I do say at the beginning as well that, I mean, it's not going to be deconstruction in a pretty conventional sense.
This is criticism, which is fine. Yes, we must do this, but at the same time, we should not throw the baby with the.
Well, it's what the relationship between the baby and the bathwater is. That if the bathwater is the urination of the baby, maybe we should throw it out. Sorry, I'm being vulgar. But yeah, I find your remark really interesting, your observation really interesting. But the idea of the Holocaust is something which modifies. I mean, I can't help thinking of Aimé Césaire, the African thinker, who said that the reason Europeans are so traumatized by the Holocaust is because it's when Europeans finally did to other Europeans what they had been doing to Africans and Arabs and Turks for centuries. And so, yeah, I mean, so when we ask for the legacy of Europe there, I'm not sure if, like, as someone who lived in Germany 3 years, I'm not sure if the legacy at the moment that we have in terms of the utterly honourable and completely commendable German efforts post-war, which have been done to verarbeiten, to work through the memory of the legacy of that, I'm not sure if that necessarily doesn't remain enclosed within the logic of Europe. The responsibility there is the responsibility for what we did to ourselves. But the largest, I'll briefly point and I'll let you come back, I'm sorry, but I just want to say, the largest genocide in the history of the planet, I bet most Europeans don't even know about, the Belgian Congo, between 1873, 1891. They're talking about 20 to 25 million dead. But it doesn't matter, because they were just Africans, you know? It's not a big deal, yani. But what I'm saying is that the idea of a European legacy, even invoking the idea of the Holocaust as something we must never do again, for me, is
Okay, what I brought two different points together in a rush, but if I need to specify the first point about the new racist thinking in Europe and its relation with the whole Holocaust, that problematic, I'm kind of reiterating the point that David Goldberg made some years ago. It is this: given that racism doesn't exist in Europe, it is American. It's an American phenomenon, according to Europeans. It is all right for Europeans to talk about racism in the United States and elsewhere, but Europe doesn't have a racist history. It has only one racist history: Holocaust. Okay. And Goldberg says, how did we do, this is the phrase he says, how did we do it to people who were among us, who were like us? That dynamic is a justification of doing it to people who are different. They were so similar to us. They were like us. Oh my God, how did we do it to them? So the guilt, the whole white liberal guilt in Europe, is the point in which now the Islamic racism against other groups, mainly Islamic minorities today, we are talking about, is the justification of this. So it's not irrelevant. These two dynamics are not independent from each other, is what I'm trying to say. It functions as an alibi. How did we do to people who were like us, similar to us, is the justification of doing it to people who are different. So difference is the nature of the, today, it's so unbelievably the comfort, I can't believe the comfort within which multiculturalist days, the regret for the multiculturalist days today. Oh, we were multicultural at some point, and that's the reason why we've got this Islamic problem now. So this open form of racism, what is unbelievable, impossible if it is uttered against the Jews. Let's think of the Danish cartoons. Think of what's going on in Netherlands, and also all the burqas and all the other things, that arguments circulating around these things. What is it that justifies this open racism today that is now impossible to do for the Jews, which was possible then? Right? So I think it's a very interesting dynamic that's going on. But then, as we are criticizing that history, there is something that we want to hold on to, because we cannot get away with the idea of liberty, freedom, and so on and so forth. These are essential, fundamental ideas with which we also need to criticize Europe.
I mean,
so I'm bringing two different points.
No, but I completely, I mean, I agree with you, but I'm just saying that, like, you end by saying, what can we do? You reiterate the European ideas, but I'm not disagreeing with you, but I'm just saying perhaps we need to reflect, perhaps even reiterating Adorno, on how those ideas you are now saying we should have recourse to led us to 1945, 1936. Do you know?
Maybe we should, think through the fact that there are different ideas of Europe in this tradition. So which ideas have led us to Holocaust, and which ideas may, save us from events like Holocaust?
Right. Yeah. Definitely, like a plurality of. But I think for me, there's something. There's a kind of a homogeneity about the word Europe. No matter how much we try and pluralize it, there seems to be certain moments where, once it's out there in the public discourse, okay, in one sense it is semantically fragmented, so it does become different things. But it does seem to have, particularly when we're talking about, for example, asylum seekers, or the North African coast, there's something so powerfully oppressive about it that even if it did possess a plethora of ultimate dimensions, it seems to be in that performative moment irrelevant, because it's written on the signpost. And if you step over that sign, they stick you in a car and they drive you back where you came from. Right. So no matter, and I guess no matter how multifaceted this legacy is. And I completely agree that we should sort of work through, in the German sense of the word, that legacy. Yeah? Not just in terms of, you know, how could 1936, 38 happen, but completely, 2 centuries, work through that legacy. But at the same time, we have to be aware of the exoteric facticity of the word Europe. The fact that, you know, in many cases, 1,000 seminars like this doesn't really mean anything to the Senegalese, the Nigerians, who are shot dead, you know, 15 miles away from Gibraltar. They're seen as complete worms. There's something for me quite chilling about the coexistence of these two things, you know? Which is why I'm kind of wondering, I mean, basically, I'm wondering whether we should have the word at all.
Yeah.
I mean, that really, I mean, I don't want to be like, sort of like,
yeah,
pessimistic.
Maybe we should emphasize that your fourth way of deconstruction, you know, which amounts to de-universalization or provincialization, I mean, reduces Europe to one of these regions for the emergence of ideas such as liberty, freedom. So there can be other sources too. In that sense, yeah, you know.
Which is
how much time do we have for the questions? Go ahead. Right. Okay, there's a person
always.
at the back who wants to.
Hello, Dr. Almond. Nice to see you back in Istanbul. I wanted to go along with your kind of anti-cerebral, this kind of, you know,
Anti-cerebral. Sorry if I'm coming across as anti-cerebral
way of approaching deconstruction, in that approaching it through the gate of ideas, but more towards what you were saying, kind of the material forces that that perpetuate the idea of Europe. And even as long, I mean, the economic factors being there, and I take it for granted that these economic factors push forward an idea of Europe, but also coming to like production of culture, for instance, as material culture, ways of life. In many ways, you know, people remain European on a daily ritualistic basis, even when it comes to creation of universities, for instance. Like, in many ways, you know, we're European when it comes to many ways of our lives. So I guess what I'm asking is if we can have a seventh way of deconstruction through practice. I think kind of going along with your this idea, brainstorming over deconstruction, but actually do something about it. How would you envision that kind of seventh way of deconstructing? What rituals would we inhabit on a material culture, in production of culture and economics, that would help us to, again, relegate Europe to kind of a history book place? What ways of life could we?
I mean, just off the top of my head, like one of the things that I suppose I concentrate my efforts in is trying to develop relationships or find relationships between non-Western countries, non-Western regions. So like in the case of Islam, instead of sort of constantly being obsessed with Islam and the West, which I find to be, you know, an increasingly exasperated theme, looking at new emergent areas like, you know, Islam in Latin America, looking at relationships between China and South Asia and Latin America, sort of like, if you're speaking practically in terms of what practical things, trying to sort of, as Europeans, I do think we are somewhat self-obsessed, without being sort of, but there is if you look at sort of most books about Europe, they too do tend to be sort of like inward-looking. And I suppose perhaps even a healthy dose of oblivion, you know, trying to imagine what a different world would look like without Europe might be a practical beginning. I'm not saying that's an ideal solution, but at least sort of it would get us beyond Belgrade and Gibraltar, right? I mean, sort of like, which is why of all these strategies here, I do like the idea of reconfiguration. I mean, it's not wildly original, and it's not, but at least thinking of the Mediterranean as a sea, you know, when you think of it like that, as a common sea, to begin with, you ask yourself, why is the northern shore, you know, it's like you saw a lake, and on the northern shore of this lake, all these rich people lived, and on the southern shore, all these poor people lived. Now, and that's been like that for 150, 200 years. And whenever people try to tell me how wonderful European modernity is, I simply ask, well, why hasn't the wealth, if it's so wonderful and world-embracing, why hasn't that wealth spilled over? You know, it's stopped. And for me, those symbolic lines, it's much more, I think, subversive to try and think about spaces which are alternative to the ones that we are sort of, that we download and install in our heads every time the word Europe is imagined. So that would be like one practical way, just sort of like trying to think of relationships between non-Western countries.
Thank you very much. Now we have to bring to an end this wonderful exchange between Jan and the public. I have two announcements to make. First, on the 15th of May, which is next Tuesday, the fourth talk of Europe as an Idea public lecture series will take place with the participation of Prof. Shiba Grovogi. I hope I didn't mispronounce his name. The title of his talk will be Europe in the Modern World, a Post-Colonial Perspective. And the fifth talk will be on the 22nd of May with the participation of Nilüfer Göle. And her title is Decentering Europe, Recentering Islam. And you are all welcome to these talks. Thank you.
Thanks again for moderating. No, it was great to have you here. Oh, teşekkürler Musa. Thanks for that.
Nice to meet you.
Oh, nice to meet you too. What was your name again? Mahmut.
Hocam isterseniz vaktiniz varsa kahve içmek için.